It was amazing. I think it made the story feel as though it came to life. And Charlotte did an amazing job. She was so committed, and it wasn't an easy story for her. And she was amazing. Well, first of all, thank you. I actually try and just, I think, capture the rhythm and chaos of my thoughts. I love sentences, and I love the infinite variation of the sentence. I like stretching sentences. I like the feeling of a short sentence. And I guess in a sense, there's both thinking and not thinking, if that makes sense. Look, La Donna Canone is a real woman, in the sense that many, like decades ago, I did actually end up in a really deadbeat hotel in the middle of nowhere that was run by a woman who was a chain smoker, and who in many respects treated us pretty badly, but she was also mythic, and she was also a figure that was remarkable and that made me she was unforgettable. So the story was written probably 30 years after the event, and yet La Donna Canone still lived for me as she had done when we spent that sort of ill-fated night at Via Beatrice, so at Hotel Beatrice. So it is one of those things that I think that when you write, in some ways you do try and preserve something from your life, the people that you encounter. And I think she's also the figure of, as I say, Francesco Di Gregori is an amazing musician. And I think it probably took listening to the lyrics of his song La Donna Canone to sort of help me to find a way into turning it into a story. So yeah, she is a sort of a mythic, sort of woman from a very sort of distant past, but also she's just, as I say, she's a figure that kind of still lives in many ways. Look, I think it's because, actually, the story of Lot is just so terrible. I mean, he basically prostitutes his daughters in order to be hospitable. So I think it's partly, sort of this sort of drive to bring together those parts of life that are often just relegated or erased from these really normative, like just the clean, hygienic, orderly existences that we live, that it's like that are just veneers. Like there's this veneer of the way that we live, and then there's all of these experiences and bodies and all of these things that just don't fit. And I think that sort of the carnival recognizes that, fairy tales recognize it, like the dark fairy tales recognize it, the grotesque recognizes it, horror recognizes it, and so I guess it was just this drive to bring together all of those things that are sort of absolutely part of what it is to be alive. And I think also when I think about being young, I remember the horror of growing old, the fear of it. And, you know, like in some ways, like so much of what the body does as it ages is horrifying. And it's just loss. You know, and so you have to find ways, and that's what the imagination does, is it finds ways to transcend the horror, to give meaning to the ways in which we fall apart. So, and also there's that fantastic, you know, that there's that sort of fantastic Rabelaisian kind of way in which all of, you know, sort of it's out of decay and it's out of death and it's out of excrement and it's out of that life begins again. So, you know, it's that cycle, as opposed to like the kind of the linear, chronological, orderly, normal kind of way of living that sometimes you just want to get away from. Well, you know, it's interesting because crane flies, and I hadn't seen them for decades. You know, sort of the first time I saw a crane fly was actually at that hotel, and I was so fascinated by their bodies because, you know, they were both kind of a little bit scary because they looked like mosquitoes, and like you just always, nobody wants to get bitten by mosquitoes, but then they were giant mosquitoes, and so I always remember being fascinated by these bodies. And recently I've started finding them at home, but actually crane flies are one of these creatures, and I didn't find a way to sort of work it into the story, but they don't eat once they become adults. And so a lot of the story is about ingestion and, you know, sort of eating and, you know, sort of who's eating, who's not eating, how are we eating, what are we getting to eat, you know, all of these kinds of things. And so I love the grotesque because I think in those unusual couplings, like radical things happen. And so the creatures, and you know what I sort of hope is that the creatures, La Donna Canone, the characters, you know, obviously they're all radically different, but then at different points in the story, they kind of become radically one as well. And I always have this sense that insects, because we are naturally a little bit sort of perturbed by them, they have this raw end of the deal. And so like the cannonball lady, like the, you know, sort of the clandestine migrant, like the lovers, you know, they're all sort of pushed to the outs, to the, you know, the peripheries, to the outside, to the, you know, what's sort of excluded or expelled. And so I wanted the story to bring them all in, and kind of knit them together in a way that hopefully, you know, gave them a place. Because I think, you know, it's really obvious right from the beginning that the narrator has this, you know, sort of both terror but also loathing, you know, sort of this sense that she's alien to her. And I think that, you know, we're so often guided by these impulses of either attraction or repulsion. And they're so strong and they're so visceral, and they tend to shape our relationships and our interactions. And so it was really important that, yes, you know, she was absolutely repelled, repulsed, you know, horrified by this person who'd actually been pretty unkind to her. But it was also about, you know, I guess it's almost like the, because there's that Herrera novel, like the transmigration of souls, and you know, so it is this sort of sense that there was this kind of transmigration, or you know, sort of this becoming, And there is a little bit in the story where and which wasn't kind of in that recording, where the couple essentially become the elderly couple, and so it is just this kind of mapping of one onto the other that becomes sort of transformative. And it's not like an easy, or look, let's just love everyone or something like that, like that's just nauseating and annoying, but the sense of being one with everyone, like that's difficult, and so that's kind of what I wanted for her in that moment, is the very person who was the most horrifying to her, to be her. So yeah. Well, look, I think it was because part of the story was, of course, sort of this ordeal where the possibility of becoming legal depended on them doing well at the hotel, because like there used to be a law in Italy where if you could get a padrone who would like sponsor you after a certain number of years or whatever, you could actually get documents if you didn't have them to begin with, and so the stakes were high for Sofian, and so in a sense that even though their relationship was like highly fraught, argumentative, 1 minute sort of passionate sex, and the next minute sort of arguing and frustrated and wondering if a relationship can hold, so they sort of existed between those two poles, and of course the sort of the separation after the sort of the failure, the failed hotel experiment, do they stay together, do they part, and I guess sort of whether or not they marry in the story, it ends with them coming back together again, and I guess that sort of for all of the sort of the problematic and sort of extremities of their sort of feelings for each other, there is also I guess the irresistible magnetic force that brings them back together again. And so that was really important. And of course it was important that I guess it was sort of I guess Sofian coming back, because it was perhaps more evident that the Australian was fond of Sofian, so I think it was it was a way of sort of showing their mutual sort of connection. Look, I love the title because it's both a noun, sort of as in it's the insect, the crane flies, but then, there is this sort of weird moment where you don't know what the story's about, and is the crane flying, so I love a title that raises a question, or perhaps sort of makes somebody stop to try and make sense of it, because if the crane flies, then you're probably going straight to the insect, but if you don't, then you're going to sort of wonder what it is, and of course I do love the grotesque, and I do love the fact that the grotesque marries the organic and the inorganic, life and death, beauty and sort of horror, and all of those kinds of things. So I liked the play on that, but also because essentially it is a story, I guess, about outcasts in so many respects, and so it seemed nice that the least sort of prominent members of the story got the title, and that was the crane flies. And of course, like I have thought about like La Donna Canone as another title, but in the end I felt like the crane flies perhaps just opened the story out to, I guess, to allow in other sort of other possibilities, and perhaps just a slightly different emphasis and I liked the emphasis on the insects. Look, this is perhaps this is actually the second time that I've had a work performed to a live audience. And I mean, part of the reason that I was so thrilled about the StorySALOON and what it was doing for the short story was because the very first time that I very reluctantly took part in something like that was a total revelation. Because, you're quite right that as a writer, often all you're really sort of aiming for is publication. And it made me think of that as something, obviously it's so important for writers, but also there was something a little bit sterile about that. And the experience of having a story sort of read out loud and responded to sort of in the moment is extraordinary. And perhaps just because there's always a little bit of stress, around having your own story read out, but I was absolutely entranced listening to the stories that came before. And I think that feeling of being drawn in by the human voice, by somebody actually there before you in flesh and blood, reading out loud, is absolutely magnetic and unique. And I absolutely loved it. Like it is just immediately gratifying, but also it sort of was more like listening to somebody else's story. And like Charlotte did such an incredible job, and in some ways it became a little bit her story. So it was a wonderful experience.